welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today we're talking about what you can do if your listing is not selling. So, we're going to dive into a few different strategies that you can lean into here, some of which will involve the seller, and some of which actually involve the seller a little bit less. And these are a few different things that you can do together. And at the very end, what we're going to discuss is what to do if you overpriced the listing and it's not selling because we suggested a number that was too high, which does happen. We will dive into that. So, first off, when we're diving into this conversation, it is going to be a difficult conversation with a seller. And as such, we have to ensure that we're approaching this in the right way. So, the right way to have this conversation is actually in a hierarchy of how we go about communicating. We do not want to have this conversation over text message or even over email. We don't want this to be in written form. And the reason for that is it's too easy for them to misinterpret the written form. So, in an ideal world, we are doing this in person, although that's not always realistic. I understand that. But ideally, we are doing this face to face so we can have a true face to face conversation. Failing that, we can use Zoom. And if we don't have access to Zoom, then we can do a phone call. But in an ideal world, it is in person and then Zoom and then phone. But we're avoiding written. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't communicate to them over written and give them updates on what's going on. But if we're actually going to dive into why a listing isn't selling and to come to a conclusion together on how to approach this, it should truly be done using our voices and ideally in person where they can see you. Next, how do we actually approach this conversation? Well, we want to approach this conversation with an open mind. We want to be curious, but we also want to be empathetic. This is difficult for a seller. It's difficult for a seller to think their home is worth a certain price or to get very excited about selling for a certain price and then only to be let down. That's difficult. We need to be empathetic towards them. But in doing so, we also have a responsibility to be honest. So here is how I tend to approach these conversations: empathetic, but honest. We do not want to cover up what's actually happening here and what will actually drive the result that we're looking for, which most of the time, of course, we're going to discuss this, but most of the time, what we're looking at is a price reduction. But how we approach this conversation can really impact how the conversation actually plays out. So, the first thing that we're doing when we are discussing this and we are trying to come to a solution with the seller, again, what we're doing here is we're positioning ourselves on the same side of the table. We're on the same team as them. It's not us telling them to do anything. Basically, what I want out of this conversation is to figure out where they stand. And so we can make adjustments as needed to help them get their desired result in the desired time frame. And so if we open up the conversation like that, instead of us going to this conversation looking for a quote unquote price reduction, then we're going to be much better off. So I want to approach this like a strategy discussion on what we can do. And maybe they don't even need to, or they want to reduce the price because they're okay holding on to this property. If I don't know that, then I can't advise them. So, the way that I approach this conversation is a this or that question, or a what's worse question. They tend to be the same thing. So, the way that we approach this question, and it's actually more of a closed question, is to explain to them where we've been and how we've actually done so far. This is a very important step. And then from there, detail a couple of options for them. Now, when we're detailing these options, we're basically trying to understand which direction do they want to go. So if I was to go into this, I would start by explaining where we've been. So how long we've been on the market, and then what we've seen so far, number of showings, what we've gotten for feedback, what the competition has done, what we've done for marketing. So using this question, once we've already detailed where we've been, then we're going to give them a couple of options on where we can go from here in order to get them the result that they're looking for. So in the what's worse question, or the this or that question, we're giving them a couple of options. So the first option is likely going to be, we can stay where we're at with our current price. We may not end up selling, or it may take us quite a bit longer to sell and more showings, but that's okay. Ultimately, I want to support you either way. Or we could reduce the price, which would open us up to a new set of buyers. Now, in asking a question like this, we're giving them two roads. But if we just leave it wide open, then at times we may not end up getting a response that will actually be productive. For example, you'll get this response: can't you just do more by way of marketing? Can you just put more ads towards my listing? And although, of course, we could do that, we all know that if we just say, yes, oh, that's going to do it, that we're actually not being honest because that honestly won't necessarily sell the home. Sometimes it may, but for the most part, it won't. And so this is where we're dropping our honesty. So we need to be empathetic to the fact that this is a difficult decision for them to make, but we also have to be honest and say the market is speaking to us. And the market's saying that we are looking a little bit high on price. So we do have one of two options here. We have the option of staying where we're at, which means we may not sell or it may take us quite a bit longer. Or alternatively, we can reduce the price, open ourselves up to a new set of buyers, and see if that is what it's going to take in order to sell your home. And so by doing this or that, or what's worse question, we're giving two options. And those two options allow them to choose one that best suits what they're looking for. And ultimately, when I wrap up this question, at the end, I'm saying I support you either way. If we want to stay where we're at, we're still going to go 110% marketing your home in order to sell it for the highest price. If you want to reduce the price, we're going to do the same thing. So they need to know that regardless of which decision they make, you are behind them. That's a very important component to this discussion. Okay, so after that, after the fact that we've already started this difficult conversation, what else can we do in order to help sell this listing? And the first and most obvious that we've already discussed is a price reduction. But how we approach this price reduction conversation is key. And what we need to do here is we need to acknowledge what they are thinking. And this is a mistake that a lot of agents will make, is they'll suggest a price reduction. They'll say, what do you think? But we're not acknowledging what they could actually be experiencing at that moment. So the way that I would suggest bringing this up is by saying, I would suggest a price reduction. And I know that this probably feels like money leaving your pocket. But in fact, what we're doing instead is we're better setting ourselves up to sell for the highest price in this market. So there's a few key words that came up there. And first off, what we did is we said it's feeling like money's leaving your pocket. So that's acknowledging the fact that by reducing the price, the seller feels like they're taking a lower price. So we're acknowledging that. And in fact, that's not true. What's happening when we're reducing the price is we're putting ourselves in a better position to sell for the highest possible price that the market will bear right now. And so that's a common concern for a seller, is when we're going to be reducing that price, I'm going to be losing money. And that's not true. And so that's what we're doing when we're first bringing this up, is we're saying it can feel like money leaving your pocket, but in fact, and then we move into the second part of the discussion. And now the second part of the discussion here is saying that we're setting ourselves up to sell for the highest price that the market will allow. And so we want to reassure them that by reducing the price, we're still going to sell for the highest possible price. But the key term here is the end as well. And there we say the highest possible price that the market will allow or the market will bear. And the reason we say that is because it's so market dependent. And we're dealing right now in a very dynamic real estate market. And so we can't know with 100% certainty when we're pricing a home what it's going to sell for. Nobody can tell them that. However, the market can tell them that. And so we want to let them know that we will help sell their home for the highest possible price that the market will bear. And then from there, we're allowing them to make their decision. Now, what about some other strategies that we can use beyond just a price reduction? Well, a price reduction tends to be the biggest rock. So that's the most important thing that we can do in order to actually drive more interest into this listing and hopefully get an offer. However, we can also start to play around with other things. And these other things really start to land in the marketing sphere. Now, when we're talking about marketing here and when we're talking about price reductions, by just throwing more money in an ad at an overpriced listing, no amount of advertising will sell an overpriced listing. That just won't happen. However, we can be strategic with how we approach this, and we can do a price reduction in conjunction with a marketing strategy change. So maybe we're doing a price reduction in conjunction with a listing description update. Now, this can be very strategic because when we do the price reduction, people are going to see the listing and they're going to reread the listing description. So it makes a lot more sense to update the listing description before we do the price reduction, and then making sure that when we do the reduction, the listing description's updated. You could do the same thing with the photos. You could do the same thing with the general marketing on MLS. Can we update the listing in conjunction with a price reduction? Now, this serves a number of purposes. The first one is that yes, people are going to see it because you're reducing the price at the same time that you are making a change to the marketing. Higher likelihood that buyers out there are going to see this change and then be able to respond to it. Although, on top of that, the other thing that this is doing is it's becoming a this and that sort of concept where, yes, we can reduce the price, but we will also do this. And so you're doing something, and then they're, in a sense, doing something. What they're doing is they're reducing the price. What you're doing is changing the marketing approach. And together, you're moving in the same direction. And so you're doing this in conjunction with a price reduction. It can be a very powerful strategy. Now, what about some more general marketing strategies that we can use? So, we talked about listing description. We talked about photos. We talked about a different order. We can reorder new photos or take different angles of photos. We can get a video done. There's a lot of different marketing strategies that we can use. But when we're also thinking about marketing, at this point in time, it can be very worthwhile to be thinking about feedback. And so, how can we get more information about how the market is responding to the listing? Well, we can host open houses, we can host realtor open houses, but we want feedback. We want to know their unbiased feedback. And I will ask this of buyers as they're coming through. I will say, how does this home compare to other ones that you've seen? The beautiful thing about this is it leads to a great conversation with the potential buyer. And from there, you can start to build rapport. But on top of that, I'm also getting feedback and I'm writing that feedback down. That client is actually seeing me write that down as I'm writing down their feedback for the seller. Now, the same goes for other agents if we're doing an agent open house. Other ways that we can get feedback, we can send the listing to our broker or to somebody at our office and ask them to provide us with a complete third party, unbiased opinion on pricing and to actually ask them if we can use their language in sending it on to the seller. So, what's an example of this? So, I send you, a colleague, my listing that's not selling, and I ask you to provide some feedback on pricing and just generally speaking, and send that to me over email. And then I package that up and I forward it directly to the seller. So it's coming from the third party, it's not coming from me. And this can then act as another source of information for them to help them make that decision. Of course, we can also increase ad spend. We can run social media ads in order to get more eyes on the property. And this, again, isn't necessarily going to sell the home and is not necessarily going to sell the home for more. Yes, we've all heard of stories of this happening, and it does happen. So we don't want to fully discount it, but we don't just want to have the property sit at $100,000 over the market value and expect social media ads to actually close that deal for us. But if we're priced properly and if we're in that range, then increasing our ad spend can make a lot of sense. And this is another thing that we can do in conjunction with a price drop. So the seller's doing the drop, and then we are increasing our marketing. And so anytime that you are giving something, it can be very worthwhile to have them give something too. This is a very common strategy in negotiations. Now, we're not negotiating with them here. We don't want to think of this as a negotiation because we're on a team and we're really trying to strategize with them. But it's worthwhile at least considering it. So when we're negotiating with somebody, if we give an inch, then we want the other person to give an inch. And that's a great negotiation tactic that we can use. And then this, in a similar vein, although we are still on the same team, we're not negotiating with them. They're doing something and we're doing something. It tends to feel like we're a team versus I'm telling them to reduce the price. We're reducing the price, but we're also increasing marketing. So we're doing things together. Now, finally, we need to reduce the price, but we're reducing the price lower than our suggested value. So in this case, we have went to the seller. The seller has followed our instructions and has listed the property in the range that we suggested, and the property's not selling. So this can be one of the most tricky conversations for us as real estate agents, but in fact, it's not really that difficult, and this is something that happens to all of us. So let's understand how we can approach this conversation. First off, if we're able to have this conversation before the problem occurs, that's ideal. Now, if we're at this point already, we can still work with where we're at right here. But in an ideal world, what we're doing when we're pricing homes is we're not saying that the home is worth what we're suggesting. We're saying that the data suggests that it could fall within this range. So if I am coming to your home to do a listing presentation, I will never tell you what your home is worth. Never. I'm going to give you a general range. On a range that would be aspirational, a range that seems average, and a range that seems aggressive. So you end up with 3 different ranges here, but what you don't end up with is a number that I think your home is worth. Now, granted, if we're at this point already and we're now starting to have to reduce below that range, and we have already told them previously that we think their home's worth a certain value, now we have to have this conversation. So, how do we start this and where do we go from here? So, at this point in time, we need to let them know how we ended up getting to the price in the first place. So, the way that we got to the price was by using historical sales, by using historical data. Even if it was a month ago, it's still historical data. And so basically, what we need to be explaining to them is in order to price a home, we really need to be looking at history. We need to be looking at what other properties sold for, and then we need to be making our best approximation to adjust for these in order to determine a general value that we see this likely trading at. We cannot say with 100% certainty. And so when we first started the conversation, we were thinking that we're in this range. However, we have the most important piece of data yet, and that's time on market. And that is the conversation that I will have with sellers. I will let them know that we use market data in order to help us determine where we think the property will sell for. But we're missing the biggest piece of data. And the biggest piece of data is time on market. And so if we've been on the market for a period of time and we have not sold, the biggest and most important piece of data has just came in. And that is that we're probably priced too high. And so this can be a really great way to have this conversation. And then you're not trying to backtrack saying, well, I said this, but I really meant that, or the seller saying, you priced it like this, and then it turns into this adversarial relationship. It shouldn't be like that at all. All we simply need to do is let them know how we went about pricing it. And we used historical data in order to price it. And now we have the most important piece of data and the biggest piece of data, which is time on market. And then from here, this allows us to then make decisions moving forward. Now, the next and final thing you can do, and you're going to want to use this one with care. You're not going to want to use this all the time. And this is only under certain circumstances where this may make sense, but you can do a price reduction with a commission reduction. That doesn't mean you're doing a price reduction at the same rate that you're doing a commission reduction. You might be reducing the price by 25K, you may be reducing commission by 1,000, but there are times where that can make sense. Now, everything's different at different offices, at different brokerages, at different real estate regions and boards. So we don't necessarily want to be going forward with this 110% unless we know the rules that are local to us. But that being said, for the most part, we do have the ability to adjust our commission. That is a lever that we can pull for most of us. And so in doing this, what we're doing is we're trying to allow them to have a little bit more room when it comes to the closing table. Now, I'm not going to do this every time I do a price reduction because, of course, what you're going to do is you're going to end up having zero money to work with. And what you're doing is you're providing a service, you're advising them. You're not guaranteeing them that their home's going to sell for a certain price. You're advising them throughout the process. And so that's what they're paying for. That being said, if there is a time where it makes sense to do this, this can make a lot of sense at this point in time. And that's because right now they're stressed, they're feeling worried. They're wondering if their home's even going to sell. And then they see their real estate agent pitching in, like you are literally pitching in money to help them sell their home. Now, if you want referrals for years and years to come, that can be a great way. That being said, we don't just necessarily want to be reducing our commission every time we do a price reduction. We don't want to suggest this all the time. There's only certain cases where I will. And sometimes that's when a property has been mispriced by quite a bit. And we're very confident in our pricing. So at times that can make sense. At times the seller can be in a very tricky position financially. And so I will be chipping in to help them through this. And at times it can just make sense. But that being said, there's a reason why we're leaving this one to the end. It's because for the most part, you're not necessarily doing this and you don't want to go to this as the first step. This is basically a last step in order to truly help your seller through this transaction. You do not want to be doing this too frequently, or we won't have a business at all. Thank you very much for watching or listening to this episode. Remember, you can reach out to me anytime on Instagram. I'm at the.michael.montgomery, or you can head over to revrealestateschool.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next lesson.